The thunder rolled across the plains of Arizona Territory as Beatrice Mitchell clutched her black veil tighter, tears streaming down her face while the preacher's words became nothing but a distant murmur in the small wooden church of Snowflake. 3 days since they'd put William in the ground, 3 days since the typhoid had taken him, leaving her alone with a ranch she couldn't manage and debts she couldn't pay. It was 1883, and the winter had been harsh in Snowflake. Most folks had already filed out after the Sunday service, but Beatrice remained kneeling in the pew, unable to face the pitying glances and whispered condolences that awaited her outside. The church had emptied until only the hollow echo of her sobs remained, punctuated by the distant tolling of the church bells marking noon. She didn't notice the spurs jingling softly as boots made their way down the aisle, nor did she sense the presence beside her until a deep voice cut through her grief. "Madam, begging your pardon, but is there anything I might do to help?" Beatrice looked up through her veil at the stranger who'd taken a seat in her pew tall, weather-worn, with kind eyes that stood out against his sun-bronzed face. His hat rested on his knee, revealing sandy brown hair in need of a trim. "There's nothing anyone can do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Unless you can bring back the dead or manage 60 acres with no hands to help." The man nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Name's Nathan Foster, madam. I rode into town last night. I'm mighty sorry for your loss." "How did you?" she began. "Small towns have big voices," he answered, a gentle smile touching the corners of his mouth. "And black veils speak volumes." The bells continued their somber melody, filling the silence between them. "Beatrice Mitchell," she finally offered. "Though everyone just calls me the Widow Mitchell now." "You're more than your grief, Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "and I happen to know a thing or two about ranching. I've been looking for work." Beatrice stiffened. "I can't afford to pay anyone, Mr. Foster. The bank is breathing down my neck as it is." "Let me help anyway," he said simply, "just until you get back on your feet." "Why would you do that?" Suspicion edged into her voice. Nathan's eyes grew distant. "Because someone once did the same for me when I had nothing." Sometimes kindness is its own payment. The last of the bells fell silent, leaving only the whisper of wind through the church's eaves. Beatrice studied him. He didn't have the look of a drifter or a criminal. There was something steady about him, like the mountains that framed the horizon. "1 week," she said finally. "You can stay in the bunkhouse, but I'll be watching you, Mr. Foster." "I'd expect nothing less, Mrs. Mitchell." The Mitchell Ranch sat 3 miles outside Snowflake, a modest spread with a 2-story farmhouse that had seen better days. Nathan followed Beatrice's wagon in respectful silence, taking note of the broken fences, untended fields, and the thin cattle grazing on winter sparse grass. "William took sick just after Christmas," Beatrice explained as they approached the house. "By the time the doctor came from Holbrook, it was too late." She pulled the wagon to a stop. "The bunkhouse is over there. It's not much." "It'll do fine," Nathan said, tying his horse to the hitching post. "If it's all right with you, I'd like to check the well in the barn before sundown." Beatrice nodded stiffly. "Supper's at 6, don't expect much." That night, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with Beatrice, going through William's ledgers. The numbers told a grim tale. "Your husband borrowed heavily last fall," Nathan observed. "The drought," Beatrice explained, twisting her wedding band. "We lost 1/3 of the herd. William was certain we'd recover this spring, but—" "You might still," Nathan said, closing the book. "There are 20 head ready for market and the south pasture looks promising for planting. If we work smart, we can make the bank payment by May." Beatrice looked at him sharply. "We?" Nathan met her gaze steadily. "I said I'd help, Mrs. Mitchell, and I meant it." Over the next few days, Nathan set to work mending fences, repairing the roof of the barn, and checking the cattle. Each evening, he'd report his progress to Beatrice over supper. She remained guarded but couldn't deny his work ethic or his knowledge of ranching. On the 4th day, Beatrice found herself watching from the porch as Nathan broke a wild Mustang he'd captured in the hills. His movements were fluid, his voice gentle but firm as he worked with the animal. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than grief stir within her admiration. That night, thunder rumbled again and rain hammered against the roof. Beatrice bolted awake at the sound of Nathan shouting. She grabbed her shawl and hurried outside to find him struggling to secure the barn doors against the wind. "The creek's rising," he called over the storm. "We need to move the cattle to higher ground." Side by side, they worked through the night, driving the cattle away from the swelling creek, soaked to the bone and exhausted but determined. When dawn broke, they stood on a ridge overlooking the ranch, the cattle safe behind them. "Thank you," Beatrice said, her wet hair plastered to her face, her dress clinging to her slender frame. "I couldn't have done this alone." Nathan nodded, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Nobody should face a storm alone, Mrs. Mitchell." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, a possibility neither was ready to name. The weeks stretched into 2, then 3. Nathan repaired machinery, helped deliver a calf, and rode into town to negotiate with the bank for more time. Slowly, the ranch began to recover, and so did Beatrice. The weight of grief still pressed upon her, but it no longer threatened to crush her entirely. One Sunday, Nathan accompanied her to church. As they entered, whispers followed them, but Beatrice held her head high. She was still in black, still a widow, but she no longer hid her face. When they sat in the pew, Nathan's solid presence beside her gave her strength. After the service, Sheriff Tom Daniels approached them on the church steps. "Mrs. Mitchell," he nodded, then turned to Nathan with narrowed eyes. "Foster, been meaning to have a word with you." Beatrice felt Nathan tense beside her. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" she asked. "Just curious about Mr. Foster's business in our town," Daniels said. "Not many strangers pass through Snowflake, fewer still who stay." "Mr. Foster works for me," Beatrice said firmly. "He's been a godsend to the ranch." "Has he now?" The sheriff's gaze never left Nathan. "And did your godsend mention he rode with the Carver gang over in New Mexico territory a few years back?" Beatrice's heart stuttered. She turned to Nathan, whose face had gone hard as stone. "That was a lifetime ago, Daniels," Nathan said quietly. "I served my time." 5 years in Yuma prison, the sheriff nodded. For robbery and accessory to murder, Beatrice felt the ground shift beneath her. The townsfolk had gathered closer, eager for the drama unfolding. "I've paid for my mistakes," Nathan said, his voice steady. "I'm not that man anymore." "Once an outlaw, always an outlaw," the sheriff spat. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd watch my back if I were you." Beatrice stood frozen as Nathan turned to her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I should have told you," he said. "I'm sorry." Without another word, he pushed through the crowd and walked away, leaving Beatrice standing alone in her widow's black, the weight of betrayal heavy on her shoulders. That afternoon, Beatrice found Nathan in the barn, saddling his horse. "Were you going to leave without saying goodbye?" she asked from the doorway, Nathan's hands stilled on the cinch. "I thought it best. The sheriff's right my past could bring trouble to your door. So instead you'll just ride away, like a coward." He turned to face her, pain etched in every line of his face. "I'm trying to protect you, Beatrice." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I don't need protection," she said, stepping closer. "I need the truth, all of it." Nathan exhaled slowly, then nodded. They sat on hay bales as he told his story, how he'd fallen in with the Carver gang as a desperate teenager, how he'd been the lookout during a bank robbery that turned deadly, how he'd surrendered rather than fire on a lawman. 5 years in prison had changed him, given him time to reflect and repent. "When I got out, I promised myself I'd live honestly," he finished. "I've been working ranches from Texas to here, trying to build a new life." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to see who I am now, not who I was," he answered simply. "And because the way you looked at me like I was someone worth trusting, I couldn't bear to see that change." Beatrice studied his face, the sincerity in his eyes, the regret etched in the lines around them. She thought about the man who had worked tirelessly to save her ranch, who had sat beside her in church when everyone else kept their distance. "Stay," she said finally. "The past is the past. We all deserve second chances." Relief washed over Nathan's features. "Thank you," he whispered. Spring arrived, bringing new life to the Mitchell ranch. The cattle grew fat on fresh grass, and the crops Nathan had planted began to sprout in neat rows. Beatrice found herself smiling more, laughing even, especially when Nathan was around. His steady presence had become something she looked forward to, something she relied upon. But not everyone was pleased with the arrangement. Sheriff Daniels made a point of riding by the ranch weekly, watching, waiting for Nathan to misstep. And then there was Edgar Wilson, the banker who held the mortgage on the Mitchell property. "Mrs. Mitchell, you must be reasonable," Wilson said during one visit, his eyes cold despite his smile. "Your husband left you in a precarious position. I'm merely offering a solution." "By buying my land for half its worth," Beatrice challenged. Wilson adjusted his gold watch chain. "Given the circumstances, a widow alone, mounting debts, I believe my offer is more than generous." "She's not alone," Nathan said, stepping onto the porch. "And the bank will get its payment on time, as agreed." Wilson's smile tightened. "Ah, Mr. Foster, still playing ranch hand, I see. How? Admirable. I wonder what the territorial marshal would think of an ex-convict inserting himself into a vulnerable widow's affairs." "Is that a threat, Wilson?" Nathan asked quietly. "Merely an observation," the banker replied, reaching for his hat. "Consider my offer, Mrs. Mitchell. It won't remain open indefinitely." After he left, Beatrice turned to Nathan. "What did he mean about the marshal?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "There are conditions to my release. I'm not supposed to leave the territory without permission, and I'm required to report to the marshal's office in Prescott every 6 months. Have you been reporting?" "Yes, but—" He hesitated. Wilson could make trouble if he wanted to. "Claim I'm violating terms, or worse." Beatrice touched his arm gently. "We won't let that happen." The next morning, Beatrice woke to the sound of horses approaching. She peered out her window to see Sheriff Daniels and 3 other men riding up to the house. Nathan emerged from the bunkhouse, buckling his gun belt. "Nathan Foster," the sheriff called. "We've got a warrant for your arrest." Beatrice rushed downstairs and out onto the porch. "On what charges?" "Parole violation," Daniels smirked. "And suspected cattle rustling. Seems some of Joe Henderson's herd went missing last night. Tracks led in this direction." "That's ridiculous," Nathan said calmly. "I've been here all night." "Can Mrs. Mitchell vouch for your whereabouts every minute?" the sheriff asked, his implication clear. Beatrice flushed with anger. "How dare you?" "It's all right, Beatrice," Nathan interrupted. "I'll go peacefully, Sheriff. We both know this is nonsense." "No," Beatrice stepped forward. "You're not taking him. This is Wilson's doing, isn't it? He wants the ranch and Nathan stands in his way." The sheriff's face hardened. "Step aside, Mrs. Mitchell. This isn't a negotiation." "Let me get my horse," Nathan said. "I'll ride in with you." "You'll ride with your hands tied," Daniels replied, dismounting. "Can't risk you running, now can we?" What happened next unfolded in seconds. One of the deputies moved too quickly, drawing his gun. Nathan reacted instinctively, reaching for his own weapon. The sheriff shouted, Beatrice screamed, and a shot rang out. Nathan staggered, clutching his side where blood blossomed on his shirt. Beatrice ran to him as he sank to his knees. He was going for his gun, the deputy stammered. "Get the doctor," Beatrice commanded, pressing her hands against Nathan's wound. Now, hours later, Nathan lay in Beatrice's bed, pale but alive. The doctor had removed the bullet and declared him lucky no vital organs had been hit. The sheriff, shaken by the shooting, had agreed to postpone any arrest until the situation with the supposedly stolen cattle could be investigated. Beatrice sat beside the bed, her hands still stained with Nathan's blood despite her attempts to wash it away. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, fear and something else, something deeper tightening her throat. "You should rest," Nathan murmured, his eyes fluttering open. "I'm not leaving you," she replied. Beatrice, he said softly, if anything happens to me, promise you won't let Wilson take the ranch. Nothing is going to happen to you, she insisted, and I'm not discussing this now. Please, he reached for her hand. Promise me. This land was William's dream and now it's yours. Don't let it go. Beatrice squeezed his hand. It's our dream now, she whispered. And I promise. The next day, surprising news arrived. Joe Henderson himself rode out to the Mitchell ranch, accompanied by his foreman. My cattle weren't stolen, the rancher explained, hat in hand as he stood in Beatrice's parlor. They broke through a weak section of fence and wandered. We found them in the North Canyon. Did you tell the sheriff? Beatrice demanded. Henderson nodded. He seemed mighty disappointed, if you ask me. Something odd going on there. After Henderson left, Beatrice sat by Nathan's bedside and told him the news. That's good, he said, still weak but more alert. But it doesn't solve our problem with Wilson or the sheriff. Maybe it doesn't have to, Beatrice mused. Joe mentioned something interesting. Seems Wilson has been buying up properties all around Snowflake, especially those along the proposed railroad route. Nathan's brow furrowed. Railroad? There's been talk of a spur line for years, but nothing official. Except Wilson seems to think it's happening, Beatrice said. What if he's been using inside information for his own gain, pressuring people to sell, foreclosing when they can't pay? That would be illegal, Nathan said slowly. But how do we prove it? Beatrice smiled, a determined, fierce smile that transformed her face. We're going to need help. Over the next week, as Nathan recovered, Beatrice put her plan in motion. She visited neighboring ranches, spoke with townspeople who had lost land to Wilson's bank, and wrote letters to the territorial governor and railroad commission. When Nathan was strong enough to ride, they traveled to Hallbrook together to meet with a lawyer who specialized in land claims. They returned with documents that changed everything. The confrontation came on a Sunday morning in the Snowflake church. Wilson sat in his usual front pew, Sheriff Daniels beside him. Beatrice entered, wearing not her widow's black but a deep blue dress that brought out the color in her eyes. Nathan walked beside her, still favoring his injured side but standing tall. Whispers rippled through the congregation as they made their way to a pew. The pastor, sensing the tension, kept his sermon mercifully brief. After the final prayer, Beatrice stood. I'd like to address the congregation, if I may, Pastor. All eyes turned to her as she moved to the front of the church. Many of you have suffered losses in recent years, not just from drought or disease, but from the predatory practices of certain individuals who place profit above community, she began, her voice steady. I stand before you today not just as William Mitchell's widow, but as a woman fighting for what's right. She unfolded a document. This letter from the Territorial Railroad Commission confirms what some have suspected: there are indeed plans for a spur line through Snowflake. Murmurs rose among the pews. What's interesting is that this information was meant to be confidential until official announcements next month. Yet somehow, certain parcels of land along the proposed route have been changing hands at alarming rates. Her gaze fixed on Wilson, who had gone pale. The commission is very interested in how this information leaked, Mr. Wilson, and how you came to acquire so many properties that will soon multiply in value. The banker rose to his feet. These are outrageous accusations. Sheriff, are you going to allow this slander? Daniels looked uncertain, his eyes darting between Wilson and the congregation. There's more, Beatrice continued. Several of you signed loan documents with terms that changed after the fact. I've collected sworn statements from 15 different landowners who experienced the same fraud. The territorial prosecutor finds this evidence quite compelling. Wilson's face contorted with rage. You meddling woman, you have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Beatrice replied calmly. A man who's been stealing from his neighbors through deceit and manipulation. A man who tried to frame an innocent person for cattle rustling to get what he wanted. The church erupted in angry voices as people turned on Wilson. The banker backed toward the door but found his path blocked by Nathan and several other ranchers. "This isn't over," Wilson hissed. "Yes, it is," came a new voice from the church entrance. A tall man in a marshal's uniform stood there, flanked by two deputies. "Edgar Wilson, you're under arrest for fraud, corruption, and conspiracy." As the marshal led Wilson away, the sheriff tried to slip out unnoticed. "Not so fast, Daniels," the marshal called. "We have questions for you too, about your relationship with Wilson and your handling of certain incidents." The church bells began to toll noon as the congregation spilled outside, watching in astonishment as both the banker and the sheriff were taken into custody. Beatrice stood on the church steps, the weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty lifting from her shoulders. Nathan came to stand beside her, his presence warm and solid. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," she corrected him. "I couldn't have managed any of this without you." The bells continued their song, ringing out across the town of Snowflake. Beatrice turned to face Nathan, no longer hiding behind a veil of grief or fear. "What happens now?" she asked. Nathan took her hand, his touch sending warmth through her. "That depends on you, Beatrice. I came to Snowflake looking for work, but I found something I wasn't expecting." "And what was that?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "A home," he said simply. "If you'll have me." The last of the bells fell silent as Beatrice reached up to touch his face. "I buried a good man 3 months ago," she said softly. "I never thought I'd find another, but life has a way of surprising us." "Is that a yes?" Nathan asked, hope brightening his eyes. In answer, Beatrice rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, there on the church steps for all of Snowflake to see. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper as Nathan pulled her close, mindful of his healing wound. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, applause erupted from the churchgoers who had witnessed this unexpected conclusion to an already eventful Sunday service. "I'll take that as a yes," Nathan murmured against her hair. 3 months later, the same church hosted a very different ceremony. Beatrice walked down the aisle not in widow's black, but in a simple cream-colored dress with wildflowers in her hair. Nathan waited at the altar, his face alight with joy as she approached. The ranch was flourishing under their combined care. With Wilson exposed and the railroad plans now public knowledge, property values in Snowflake had stabilized. The new sheriff elected after Daniels was removed from office proved to be fair and honest. As for Nathan's past, the territorial marshal had reviewed his case and, given his exemplary behavior and the circumstances surrounding the original charges, granted him a full pardon. He was truly free at last. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Beatrice and Nathan exchanged vows as sunlight streamed through the church windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The church bells rang out joyfully as they exited the church as Mr. and Mrs. Foster, greeted by cheers and well wishes from the same townsfolk who had once whispered behind Beatrice's back. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Foster?" Nathan asked, helping her into the wagon that was decorated with ribbons and flowers. "I've been home since the day you sat beside me in this church," she replied, squeezing his hand. "When all hope seemed lost, you stayed until the bells fell silent. You brought light back into my life." Nathan kissed her again as he took up the reins. "And you gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret it." As they drove toward the Mitchell now Foster Ranch, Beatrice leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching the Arizona landscape roll by. The ranch house had been repainted, the fences mended, the fields abundant with crops. It was no longer a place of grief but of new beginnings. 2 years later, the Foster Ranch was known as one of the most prosperous in the territory. The railroad had indeed come to Snowflake, making it easier to get cattle to market and bringing new opportunities to the growing town. On a warm spring evening, Beatrice sat on the porch swing, cradling their 6-month-old son William Nathan Foster in her arms. The baby had his father's eyes and his mother's smile, a perfect blend of the two people who had found each other against all odds. Nathan joined them, settling beside his wife and gently touching his son's cheek. "He's getting bigger every day," he marveled. And louder, Beatrice laughed. "Mrs. Perkins says he has the strongest lungs she's ever heard in a baby." "That's my boy," Nathan said proudly, strong like his mother. Beatrice rested her head on his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never having this? If you hadn't walked into that church that day." "I believe some things are meant to be," Nathan said, his arm tightening around her shoulders, "even when the path gets rocky and steep." As twilight deepened into night, they sat together on the porch of the home they had built together, listening to the crickets and watching the stars appear one by one above the Arizona desert. Their journey had begun in grief and uncertainty in a quiet church with tolling bells, but it had led to this moment of perfect peace. Sometimes, Beatrice reflected as she looked at her husband and son, love arrives when you least expect it, when you're hiding your face from the world. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it sits beside you until the darkness passes and a new day dawns, bright with promise.